Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pashtaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharine Nivishesha Shunyavadi Pastrata Deshatarane. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. So we are continuing with our description of Srila Rupa Goswami's deity of Govindadev or Govindaji, his journey from Vrindavan to the eventual safety of the famous city of Jaipur in present-day Rajasthan. In our last lecture, we heard how the great Moghul tyrant, Emperor Arungazebh, died in the year 1707, and how soon afterwards Govindaji was moved to the relative safety of the town Rupadeha, which was a good distance, actually, still a good distance from Amer. And that, we mentioned how that town later was renamed Govindapur. So when Govindaji finally arrived there, he was met by Jai Singh II, a great devotee king, who presented the Lord with a large quantity of gold coins. And in our last lecture, we described in different ways how this particular king, a devotee king, Rajrishi, Jai Singh II, was actually a very serious practitioner of Krishna consciousness. I even read yesterday in the Vrindavan Research Institute that he took initiation into the Nimbarka Sampradaya, although it was more of a formality in his youth. Essentially, I think we can say he was a very dedicated Gaudiya Vaisnava, follower of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And after having darshan of Govindaji, a very strong desire arose in Jai Singh's heart to bring Govindaji from Govindapur closer to his capital in his kingdom. His capital was Amer. It had been the capital for many centuries for those Rajput kings. And at that time, Jai Singh was actually planning to move his capital from Amer and by building an entire city nearby. Historians say that being part of a great dynasty of kings who had all in their own ways accomplished great things, Jai Singh II felt that by building a new capital, it would be a fitting accomplishment on his part. So he was thinking in this way, to move from Amer and build a city not too far away, but build a big glorious city. So upon returning to Amer from Govindapur, he began to look around that area, that entire region. He would go out and, look at different parts of his kingdom and think, where can I put this new city, this new glorious city? And one day, while he was searching like that, he came across a particularly beautiful area with an abundance of kadamba trees, blossoming flowers, and there was a lake full of lotuses. And this scene, this scenario, very much reminded him of Vrindavan. You can remember in our last class how we described how he had visited Vrindavan and Mathura on a number of occasions, actually. I even read yesterday in the Research Institute that during one visit to Vrindavan, he ordered a palace to be constructed for him to live in when he came to Braj. It was actually near to Keshigat on the banks of the Jamuna. Him and his family would stay there. And it still exists. It's a small palace, and it's known as Jai Singh Gira. And I believe now it's in the custody of Srila Goswami of the Radharaman temple. But actually, whenever Jai Singh would visit Vrindavan, I was reading, he would actually wander around like an ordinary pilgrim. I was reading, before he entered into Vrindavan, he would take off his shoes. He would enter into Vrindavan barefoot. He would do away with his royal umbrella and his crowns. And I read that actually he didn't even take any security. He looked like an ordinary pilgrim. He had the right mood for entering Vrindavan. And most of the time when he was wandering around Vrindavan, he spent that time associating with sadhus. This is a leader. So anyway, while walking in that particular beautiful forested area that he came across while searching for an area to build his big city, he thought that that little forest would be the perfect place to bring Govindaji and establish his worship there. Take him from Govindapur, Radha Govinda from Govindapur, and bring him to that little gardened area. So upon returning to Amer, he ordered his ministers to develop that area, making it look as much as possible as Sri Vrindavan Dham. And it's interesting, he specifically asked them to study the descriptions of Vrindavan as given by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur in his writings. He was familiar with those writings. So thousands of men were engaged in developing that area, which was already beautiful, into even more beautiful area, beautiful gardens, and along with a small but very magnificent temple they built. And because that area had, or still has, I could say, a certain glow to it, Jai Singh named it appropriately Kanaka Vrindavan, Golden Vrindavan. And while the work was going on that Kanaka Vrindavan, Jai Singh brought Govindaji, Radha Govinda, all the way from Govindapur to his capital in Amer in 1713. And he first installed him in a temple near the palace in Amer. That little temple is called Mansarovara Temple. And that's interesting to note here that as soon as Govindaji left Govindapur, the famous deities of Madan Mohan and Gopinath, Radha Madan Mohan and Radha Gopinath, they arrived and they stayed there in Govindapur. Madan Mohan, of course, was the first deity discovered in Vrindavan by Srila Sanatana Goswami 500 years ago. And while the great Saint Madhu Pandit discovered Gopinath at Vamsivat in Vrindavan a few years later. So various devotees had been taking those two sets of deities on separate journeys from Vrindavan for nearly 50 years as well. They were also moved when Arungazebh attacked Braj. Those deities were also moved, and they also gradually made their way down to Jaipur. So Govindaji was taken to the Mansarovara temple, which is next to a big lake called Mansagara. It's just below the big palace in Amer. Some of you may have been to that large palace. It's presently, for some time, it's been a big tourist attraction. It's a magnificent palace. It's like out of a fairy tale, you could say. Very beautiful. So that's where the kings lived for many centuries. So that's where Radha Govinda were taken. They were finally, in Amer, in the home of the Rajput kings. So I was reading that when Govindaji arrived in Amer and was put into that particular temple, there was a huge celebration, acknowledging that he had safely avoided Aurangzeb's determined efforts to find him and destroy him for decades. So you can imagine, finally, it took 50 years, finally, he was safe and secure in the Rajput fort in Amer palace. Of course, Aurangzeb had died several years earlier, as we mentioned, but it was well known how he had pursued Govindaji for much of his life. This was a big celebration. And in honor of that occasion, of Govindaji arriving in Amer, Jai Singh ordered a huge pillar, a very large pillar, to be made and installed in that temple. And it's called the Kirti Shtamba, or the pillar of glory. Still there, you can go and see. All the tourists see it, they don't know what they're looking at. So Govindaji was worshipped in that temple, along with Sri Radha and Gaur Govinda, the deity of that came from Jagannath Puri, Kashishwara's deity, for 2 years, while the construction of Kanaka Vrindavan took place. And during that 2-year period, Jai Singh, who was studying the teachings of Rupa Goswami, learned that an eternal companion of Sri Radha is Lalita Saki, who has many services, but one of her services is to prepare tambula or betel nut for Srimati Radharani. He was reading. And inspired by that information, how Lalita Saki is so much part of Vrindavan Leela and part of Radharani's service, he ordered his artist to carve a very beautiful deity of Lalita Devi, or to prepare a very beautiful deity of Lalita Devi, made from a combination of 8 precious metals called Ashtadhatu. Ashtadhatu, 8 precious metals. And then when Lalita Saki was, that deity was made from those metals, he then had her covered in gold. And when this incredible deity of Lalita Devi was finished, Jai Singh had her installed along with Radha and Govinda in that Mansarovar temple in Amer. Then in 1715, in the month of Kartik, Govindaji, Sri Radha, Lalita, and the deity of Gaur Govinda were moved finally into their beautiful new temple at Kanaka Vrindavan. And I found a court document written by one of Jai Singh's famous court poets. I think we've quoted him before. His name is Atmaram, wherein he, the poets are meant to glorify the king and everything they do. So this Atmaram, he describes Kanaka Vrindavan. And he's actually comparing it with Vrindavan in present-day Uttar Pradesh, where I am now. And listen to the description. It was a big thing, that they created a Vrindavan, you could say a new Vrindavan. That was Jai Singh's idea. And by studying the writings of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, the artist and the workman and so forth, they got the idea how to create it very nicely. And we do go there on our Jaipur parikramas with the devotees. Today it's still very beautiful. So he wrote, after its completion, quote, "There is a grove of karir covered with gunja berry vines where there are Molya Shri trees." I don't think they exist anymore. I haven't seen any. I've heard them described. Molya Shri trees, blooming with sweet flowers and endless creepers. There, Govinda wanders about alone with a woolen blanket under his arm, singing blissful songs. The righteous and honorable Jai Singh, out of his ardent love for Govinda, has permanently installed him in a jeweled residence there. It appears that this Vrindavan, Kanaka Vrindavan, is even sweeter than the Vrindavan north of here, unquote. He wrote like that. So Jai Singh, this Raj Rishi king, he used to come to Kanaka Vrindavan every Ekadasi to have darshan of Radha Govinda. So it was in the same year, 1715, after taking the blessings of Radha Govinda, that Jai Singh ordered work to begin on his new city, the new city he envisioned, which he wanted to call Jaipur, the city of victory. And actually it is 11 kilometers from Amer. It wasn't so far. And in between is Kanaka Vrindavan, or a little bit closer to Jaipur is Kanaka Vrindavan. So you get a picture where everything is. And it's described as India's first planned city. And it was designed by a very famous architect, Vidyadhar Bhattacharya, a very learned devotee actually, architect. And the city, he based it on the principles of Vastu Shastra and Shilpa Shastra. Everything was done according to Vastu. And that city would be completed in the year 1727. But in 1720, during construction, Govindaji appeared to Jai Singh in a dream one night. This is so interesting. Govindaji appeared because he'd rendered so much service to this deity. He actually protected this deity, took on the protection of the deity after our famous Srila Rupa Goswami and Ram Singh the first, everyone had a part to play in serving this deity. So Govindaji appeared to him in a dream, and this is what Govindaji said to the king in the dream. Quote, "O king, you are building such a large city, including a palace for yourself. Cannot you include a small space for me there as well? Can you not include a small space for me there as well?" So the next day, Jai Singh wrote a letter to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. They're all working together, Sankirtan movement. He wrote a letter to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur asking for permission to build and install Govindaji permanently in a temple in Jaipur. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur wrote back, quote, "Yes, you can establish Govindaji in your own mahal, Now it's very significant that Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur used this word mahal, because mahal literally means like one's own place, but more specifically one's own room, indicating that, whatever is inside your room belongs to you. It's your property. Now, this letter would later play a key role in a very fierce debate if Govindaji and the other deities we've mentioned should return back to Vrindavan some years later. We'll discuss this in a few minutes. Anyway, Jai Singh called for his architect, Vidyadhar Bhattacharya, and requested him that, as you've laid out this city, according to Vastu, Shilpa Shastra, you please include a very beautiful temple for Radha Govinda and the other deities for my upcoming city of Jaipur. So inspired, he got really inspired, Jai Singh then ordered that Radha Govinda be moved from Kanaka Vrindavan closer to where he was, closer to Jaipur actually. Jaipur, the construction was going on. So some buildings and residents were already, had already been constructed. So Jai Singh ordered that Radha Govinda be moved from Kanaka Vrindavan to what's called Nakur Khana, or the drum house. A beautiful residence that had already been built. And so Radha Govinda and the other deities were, worshipped there. They were moved, you could say literally, into Jaipur as it was being constructed. And they stayed there in that, it's called the drum house, for 7 years, from 1720 to 1725. We had to do a lot of research in the Vrindavan Research Institute. I was going through all these old manuscripts. So they stayed there from 1720 to 1725. Then in 1725, the deities were shifted briefly for a couple of days to other residents, because a lot of construction was going on, a lot of noise and moving this and so forth. So they were shifted a few times for their convenience to other residences. And one place that they were moved was a large tower called Govinda Bhurja. Still exists. Then they moved for a few days to a place called Govinda Beri. Now it's called Govinda Beri, near to a famous water well. And their temple wasn't completely ready yet, but Jai Singh's palace, his particular residence, was ready. And the construction of Radha Govinda's temple was being done right in front of his palace, as per his desire. So then Jai Singh did something really, really amazing. While their temple was being finished, Jai Singh arranged that Radha Govinda, Lalita, and Gaur Govinda were moved into his own newly constructed palace. He moved them into his own residence. And not only that, but he also had Radha Madan Mohan and Radha Gopinath brought down all the way from Govindapur. Remember, they were established in Govindapur after Govindaji left. And it's quite some distance away. He brought them as well into his private residence, his new palace. And all those deities, those three sets of deities, were worshipped there for 2 years. From 1725 to 1727. And I was reading in the Institute, every day was like a festival for their lordships in Jai Singh's home. Can you imagine those famous deities? He had them all moved into his palace. Then in late 1727, Radha Govinda's temple, named Surya Mahal, was completed. And Radha Govinda, Lalita, and Gaur Govinda were moved into that permanent residence where they still reside today. That's where we see them when we go on Parikrama. And Radha Madan Mohan and Radha Gopinath, they shifted to new temples, their own new temples as well. Of course, their history is a little bit different, but well, you know what happens later, but we'll discuss that in another lecture. So, as I mentioned, Jai Singh had Radha Govinda's temple built directly in front of his palace, so that when he walked out onto his veranda in the morning, the very first thing he saw were the deities, Radha Govinda. Hare Krishna. So, the city was, you could say, complete. Of course, it was always expanding, but it was considered complete in the same year, 1727. And then Jai Singh moved the entire population of Amer. Remember, that's the original kingdom. It's the palace, but also the people are living there. So many of his subjects are living there. So he moved the entire population of Amer to this new city of Jaipur. Everybody. Nobody was left in Amer. It was left for the tourists in previous or in future decades. Future generations could come and see that palace. So in time, all these three sets of deities had their followers coming to their temples in Jaipur. And this guaranteed all of these deities, Radha Govinda, Radha Madan Mohan, and Radha Gopinath, safety. Because although Aurangazeb was no longer living, the Moghul Empire still existed, of course in a weaker form, but there was still fighting going on, there was still wars going on, etc. So finally all these deities, these Vrindavan deities are protected. Such a historic moment in the history of our Gaudiya Vaisnava tradition. But ironically, after several decades, these three sets of deities being in Jaipur caused some controversy. How could that be? Well, now that the threat of Arungazebh was over, more or less over, the devotees in Vrindavan, they naturally wanted the deities to come back to Braj. Hey, they've survived, and thank you everyone in Jaipur for taking such good care of them. But there are deities. They should come back to Vrindavan. And this desire also included the Vrindavan deities of Radha Damodar and Radha Vinod, the deities of Srila Rupa Goswami and Lokanath Goswami, respectively, who were also taken to Jaipur for protection. Those are also very beloved deities for the Gaudiya Vaisnava. So all these deities were there. So, the Brajabasis in Vrindavan, they wanted them back. We're jumping ahead here a little bit. When the great-grandson of Jai Singh II later came into power, this issue came to a head. That the Brajabasis, we want our deities back. But the great-grandson of Jai Singh replied in a letter to the Brajabasis, no. He was speaking specifically about Govindaji. He said, Govindaji is situated in our Mahal, remember Mahal, our Surya Mahal, our palace, our home. This means he's our personal property. We have protected him, we will keep him. So of course that law included the other sets of deities as well, all those deities. So history has shown that all these Vrindavan deities have stayed in Jaipur. Thus in time, many devotees from Vrindavan and Bengal started visiting Jaipur and spending a lot of time in Jaipur. They came from Vrindavan, they came from Orissa, from Puri, they came from Navadvip, Mayapur in Bengal. These are Gaudiya Vaisnava deities, so there were these big pilgrimages. In principle, Jaipur became a big place of pilgrimage. I was reading that one day some disciples of Baladev Bijubhushana, a disciple of Vishwanath Chakrabarti Thakur, who lived in Vrindavan, said to Baladev in a darshan, we won't go to Jaipur. Why should we leave Vrindavan and go to Jaipur? Even if Govindaji is there, we can establish some new deities in Vrindavan and serve Krishna here. So on that particular occasion, Baladev Bijubhushana replied in a very interesting way. He quoted Srila Narottam Das Thakur saying, Shri Govinda Gopinath Madan Mohan. Where these three deities are situated, that is the real Vrindavan. Unquote. I found this quote in a yet unpublished Shastra of Narottam Das Thakur entitled Padavali, not Padyavali. This is, when we're doing our research now, when we're working in cooperation with the Vrindavan Research Institute, there's so many scriptures. I mentioned 32,000 scriptures. Many of them are Gaudiya Vaisnava scriptures. And there we're finding many manuscripts, many scriptures written by Srila Rupa Goswami, Vishwanath Chakrabarti Thakur, Narottam Das Thakur, that are yet unpublished or perhaps unknown. This is one authorized scripture that we found when we determined it was an original scripture. Well, there's various ways you can do that, by the handwriting and so forth and so on, called Padavali by Narottam Das Thakur. And we are hopefully going to find many more to share with all of you. It's an exciting project. So in Padavali we found Shri Govinda Gopinath Madan Mohan. He writes, I teen Thakur Jehi se Vrndavan. Narottam writes, wherever we find the three lords, Shri Govinda, Shri Gopinath, and Shri Madan Mohan, that place is truly Vrindavan. So Baladev quoted that. So then he concluded to his students, his disciples, you should all go to Jaipur for darshan. You can come back, but you go for darshan. So how do we understand these words that, Jaipur is the real Vrindavan? Well, in the sense that Jaipur is Gupta Vrindavan. Gupta means hidden. So it is a hidden Vrindavan because of the presence of those three original principal deities of Braj. So in that sense, real Vrindavan. And as that understanding grew amongst the Vaishnava communities everywhere, more and more devotees crowded into Jaipur. Actually, at one point I was reading, practically the whole community of Vrindavan shifted to Jaipur for some years. And historians have stated that for some time, this is also interesting, I didn't know this, Jaipur became the main pitta, or the main place, the main, you could say, school of learning for all these Gaudiya Vaishnavas, because many of Gaudiya Vaishnava saints went there, teachers. So it was a seat of learning. Everyone wanted to be with, Govindaji, Radha Govinda, and Radha Madan Mohan, and Radha Gopinath, and Damodar, and Radha Vinod. And this little bubble in history, you could say, it took place over 50 or 60 years. And of course, a number of devotees did remain in Braj, in Vrindavan, in the original Vrindavan, and they gradually, it's described, established pratibhu deities in Vrindavan. And the focus eventually shifted back to Vrindavan itself, or you could say back and forth, like today, right? We come to India and we go to Mayapur, or we go to Jagannath Puri, we come to Vrindavan, and we take a side trip down to Jaipur. It's only, nowadays, with the highway, it's only 3.5 hours, the new highway they established. So, because all these pratibhu means a deity like the original. It's considered to be non-different. The form of the deity is carved in the same way, it's installed, and it's to be understood there's no difference between the original deity and the pratibhu deity. So for all the deities, Govindaji, Madan Mohan, Gopinath, all these deities, many deities that had left Vrindavan, their pratibhu forms were installed in Braj. So devotees started moving back. And let us remember that Radharaman, beloved Radharaman, the deity of Gopalbhatta Goswami, never left. He remained in Vrindavan all that time. And Vrindavan remained very popular because of him, as it is popular today because of his worship. So Hare Krishna. We'll stop there. That's a lot for you to transcendentally digest all these. This is history. This is history. This is, you could say, modern day, or this was modern day. This was taking place in the 1700s. Modern day Leela. Very interesting. And there's so much more to discover. It's a great blessing. I feel a great blessing that somehow or other Krishna has arranged for us to have access to this Vrindavan Research Institute. It's really a lifetime, or many lifetimes of seva there to preserve all these ancient scriptures, to scan them, digitize them, publish them for all of you. The world needs this knowledge. Kali Yuga needs this knowledge, how to solve the problems. And these very deep writings by all our acharyas are present there. So we want to save them. Some of them are crumbling in my hands as I'm holding them, putting them from one place to another. So it's an urgency. And I have a team of devotees we're working with now, scholars and just people helping, with renovating the building, which is also deteriorating very quickly, putting in new copper wire and getting AC and the climate control, and it's just a lot of work. I need a lot of help. Many hands make small work, so some of you can please come forward and help us in this, serving the previous acharyas and Prabhupada's desire that these books become available to the world. So let us, and there's more coming. I have some more lectures about Jaipur as well. So we'll finish today with, I feel, very appropriate prayers. We all know these prayers, but addressing these particular three sets of deities we've been discussing today. Glory to the all-merciful Radha and Madan Mohan. I am lame and ill-advised, yet they are my directors, and their lotus feet are everything to me. In a temple of jewels in Vrindavan, underneath a desire tree, Shri Radha Govinda, served by their most confidential associates, sit upon an effulgent throne. I offer my most humble obeisances unto them. Srila Gopinath, who originated the transcendental mellow of the rasa dance, stands on the shore of Bhamsi Bhat and attracts the attention of the cowherd damsels with the sound of his celebrated flute. May they all confer upon us their benedictions. Thank you so much, Prabhus. We'll be back in a couple of days with more transcendental pastimes in Jaipur and Vrindavan. Shri Shri Gaur Nitai ki, Shri Shri Krishna Balaram ki, Shri Shri Radha Shama Sundar ki, Vrindavaneshwari Srimati Radharani ki, the 6 Goswamis of Vrindavan Dham ki, Jai Singh II ki, Jaipur ki, Go Premanandi, Jai Jai Sisi Radhe Sham. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.